Hi, this is Kate Trinka. I'm here with Jennifer Wilhoit to talk about her book, Writing on the Landscape, Essays and Practices to Write, Roam, and Renew. We are so excited to have you, Jennifer. Jennifer has her Ph.D. and is a spiritual ecologist, the founder of Teal Arbor Stories, and the author of books, articles, and blogs focused on the inner and outer landscape. You can visit her online at tealarborstories.com. And we're just excited to have you here today, Jennifer. And before we get started, I'd just like to point out that there is a chat box in the bottom of your screen if you're joining us. Thank you for being here. This is being presented to you through the Charter for Compassion, so thank you. Jennifer, thanks for being here. It's so lovely to see you again. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about your book. Would you like to just tell us how you got started in writing this book for us?
Yes, thank you, Kate. First of all, I really want to thank you and Mimi, who is behind the scenes doing all the tech wizardry, and also the Charter for Compassion. Over the last several years, I've had the great pleasure of working with the Charter in a number of ways, teaching for the Education Institute and doing another webinar. And I love the Charter.
Me too.
And so I just want to say to whoever's listening that you've tuned into a really fantastic organization, and it is such an honor to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
So I have written this book, Writing on the Landscape, Essays and Practices to Write, Roam, Renew, as Kate so in such a lovely way introduced. And I was actually asked to write this book by my clients several years ago, a little more than several years ago now, because it took several years to write it. And so I need to say something about the work I do so that listeners can understand, the people joining us today can understand sort of how the book grew and became something. So I work with clients all over the world. Mostly what I do is what I call writing mentorship. It's people who are wanting to write something or have started to write something or have an idea to write something, but feel stuck or confused or just want some support and guidance. So that is the bulk of what I do. I also do creativity, coaching, and life transition support, and a lot of land-based, earth-based work, nature-based work. And in working with clients in the early days of my practice, Teal Arbor Stories, clients started saying, well, gosh, I take notes every time we meet. And it would really be nice if I just saw this all in print, if you would just write a book, please, and share everything in the book that you're telling us. And I smiled the first few times, said, yeah, that's nice. And then I started realizing that there really was a call for this book. There really was a need. People were asking for it. And so I began writing the book. And the actual writing of the book didn't take but several months. But the delays and the many geographic moves that we made during the time I wrote the book, and a few other distractions, ended up really stretching out the length of time between the first words on the page and the actual publication of the book. So that's my small little initial encouragement to anybody who wants to write, that it really doesn't matter. Sometimes it takes a long time, even if the writing itself goes quickly. You might just find a lot of need to clean your house or do other things as a distraction from writing. So in putting together this book, I divided it into 4 sections: body, emotions, mind, and spirit. And I tried to connect those with the earth elements of earth, water, air, and fire, just to remind people we are connected to the natural world. And so the practices in the book are things that are intended to be done on a regular basis, a frequent basis, for some of us daily, to really keep our creative juices flowing. So this book is called Writing on the Landscape, but I probably could have called it Painting on the Landscape, or Living Well on the Landscape, or a whole lot of other things, because it's really about a process of engaging life, engaging the natural world, and finding the fullness of ourselves so that we can then embark on whatever our good work in the world is.
Thank
That's
you.
the short story of writing the book.
I'm totally enjoying the book, and I just love your soul and your spirit. One of the things that you bring up in the book is that you refer to like an inner and an outer landscape. Can you tell us like what you mean by that?
Yes, thank you for asking. So I deliberately tried not to use the phrase inner outer landscape actually in the book, though it's all over the book and my bio and other places. Um, it's really work that I've been doing personally for my whole life, and then professionally through research and studies and practical hands-on stuff in my professional life and in my education. And it's really that I believe there's a conversation that happens between us and what's going on inside of us, maybe emotions or the place in us where we find the divine. For some people, that might be a religion or a spiritual practice, and what's going on in the outer world. And I mean, when I say inner outer landscape, very literally the natural world, but it might also be the stresses outside of us, the life outside of us, our work, or a joyous circumstance in our life. And those things that are happening outside of us do communicate with what's going on the inside of us. So it's kind of a whole book in and of itself, which is why I tried to avoid using that term too much in this book, because I was not going to spend the 200 pages I needed to actually define that in this book.
Yeah. There's just so many quotes I loved in when I was reading this. One thing that just pulled me, and I don't exactly know why, but I wanted to bring it up anyways. You said, I had to live my way into writing. There's something about that just drew me, and I wrote it down, and I don't even know what to ask you about it other than it was really touched me somehow. So
thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for the heart that you're bringing to this conversation today, because I do, for me, what that means is I didn't just, even with this book, I've done a lot of writing. I have experience writing. I have other publications, but we don't always just sit down and write. We have to live life. Life happens. Even when we go on writing retreats, I'm offering one next weekend. Even when we have time that we set aside where most of what we'll be doing when we're not eating or sleeping is writing, we still have life going on. And I think there's a really dynamic relationship between our writing life and our lived life. That is all of the life that's happening when our fingers aren't on a keyboard or our hands on a pen. And so when I learned to be a writer, it was really about a process over many, many years of gaining confidence, gaining skills, figuring out what the heck I was going to say, having a desire to write, but not knowing what to put on the page is a thing. It's a real thing. And so that's what I was trying to refer to in that. And throughout the book, I think we live and we write not as mutually exclusive to one another, but together we do those things.
Beautiful. Thank you. Another quote I loved was, writing leads us into ourselves and it leads us back out again. Nature does so also.
Yes, so that's that reference to the outer landscape again. We reach out there, and often I think our culture is really focused on that outward grab. I discovered yesterday when I was watering one of my new baskets, a hanging basket of flowers, that there was a nest forming in there. In fact, I was so awestruck that I called my neighbor over and said, "This is a nest, right?" Because it wasn't, the bottom isn't there yet. It was just the outer ring. And of course, then there was the dilemma of, do I water the plants or do I let the flowers die so that the junco can have his nest? And so I've been kind of sitting with that for the last 12 hours since I discovered the nest. But there's that that direct connection between that focus on, I'm going to grab something out there and it's going to make me feel better in here. But I really think that though there is some connection there, we really we'll find a more sustaining peace, a more sustaining answer to the dilemmas in our lives if we also look inward and trust what's there. And I think when we look nature in his bald-faced eye and see the bird on the tree or the leaf that's starting to unfurl, we see something of ourselves in that. If we can stop long enough, pause long enough, get quiet enough to pay attention.
Yeah, one of the things, and it's sort of a little bit similar to something that was in scripture, but it's something that I'd come up with when I was very young. I said, be still, period, listen, period, and know. And, you know, in scripture, then I've seen it similarly, but just a little bit different. And I think you're right. If we take the time just to pause and take a breath and just notice, there's the nature mirrors us all the time and gives us messages that we need to hear if we can just stay connected to it. And that brings me up to this this word that I'm not sure if you coined it. I think you probably did. You talked about mindset versus heart set. And I think we probably need to use both our minds and our hearts, but it feels like we spend a little bit too much time in our minds and maybe not enough time in our hearts. And so could you talk about about that word? Because I just love it.
So there's no magic in that word other than it just came off my fingertips in the moment writing. That's the truth. I didn't sit around thinking about heart set, but I do think a lot about compassion, which is why I love the charter, that there's a focus on how do we just reach out in a gentle way. There's so many things in the world that are strife-filled, that are agonizing. And so how do we get tender around that stuff? And so, you know, I was taught as a scholar in grad school, though I was very, very fortunate to be with a group of people who were very lovely, heart-based, compassionate people who I was in an environmental studies program, and we were all doing different kinds of work, some more qualitative, some more quantitative science. And yet it was a scholarly program. And so we were taught to solve problems with our heads using critical thinking skills. And there's a huge value in that. And as you and I talked about yesterday, Kate, in preparing for today's webinar, if we do that practice of applying our minds and logic to problems at the expense of using our hearts and our compassion, the center of compassion within ourselves, then it's going to be a little bit harder, I think, to find a full and balanced approach. And so Heartset was one of those beautiful, lovely accidents when I was writing. Sometimes they're the accidents that I quickly scrub off the page with a delete button, but that was one that just needed to remain.
Yeah, I really like it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
I also want to point out that, you know, I'm keep pulling us back to nature because that's my heart as well. But, you know, at the beginning of your book, you know, you talk about this book, not just, you know, for anybody who needs to write, you know, whether it's you have to write it for a college dissertation or you have to, you know, you want to write because you want to write a book or you're a poet or, you know, all the different kinds of writers and why we're either forced to write or we feel an urgency to write. And so can you speak about how that book, you know, how your book helps all those different types of people through the exercises?
Yes, actually. Thank you for asking that, because that's part of what I do when I'm doing kind of a standard book reading in a bookstore or at a nature center or something. I talk about that it's really The work I do is very individualized per the client, the person I'm working with. It's very intuitive, and it's also really, really process-based. And so I might have two people who have signed on to work with me who are working on very similar projects. They're both writing a book and they're both writing memoir, let's say. I do get a lot of people who write memoir. Because often when we write stories about ourselves, we do find the stuck places very easily. And so the work I do is really process-based, and no two people are going to engage the task in the same way. And so, again, using the natural world, using various writing practices, we can apply those to any genre. In the early days of my practice, I've had a number of doctoral students, grown people, grown adults, some grandmas, who are working toward earning a Ph.D. via a dissertation, who came to me for support. And it wasn't because they weren't already really, really great writers. In fact, most of the people I work with are very good writers, but we all get stuck or on a pause that we can't quite undo ourselves. And so from time to time, and so having somebody else along the journey with us on that journey can be very helpful. And so because my work is process-based, it can really apply to most genres of writing.
Nice. I did a couple of your exercises in the book, and one of the things that you talk about inner and outer landscape, and the fact that one of your exercises is to write the way that you write, which is in the landscape mode.
Okay, you did it.
Versus portrait mode. I'm so struck by, and I'd love for you to talk about it, but I wanted to share my experience. I was so struck by my ability to continue the flow of my writing by writing in this direction versus the up and down, where there's so many transitions, because you only get 10 words on, because I write small, 10 words on a line before you're moving to the next line. I probably got 20 words before I'm shifting to the next line, and it just really did. So amazingly, you wouldn't think it would make that big of a difference, but it did. Just help things just flow so smoothly, and it just, you didn't want to stop. It was really cool.
Well, thank you so much for actually being vulnerable and sharing your own personal experience with that, Kate. I really appreciate that. And there is something about the page being turned to landscape orientation and having that wider page to write on. In fact, we learned to write, and I referenced this, I think, in the book. We learned to write, at least here in the US, in the place I grew up in Southern California, we learned to write on this kind of off-white, kind of beige paper, and it had 3 blue lines per, it had a series of 3 blue lines, and 2 were a solid line, and then there was a middle dotted line. We learned to write uppercase and lowercase and cursive on those pages, and that was landscape orientation. But very quickly, as soon as we learned to write, it turned to the portrait format. And so I think there is something about having more real estate, if you will, across the page for every line. But I also think part of it is that we're trying something different. Just having the page rotated a quarter turn frees us from some, we don't even know, maybe unconscious structure in our head about how writing should be. Because there are a lot of shoulds. We have a lot of shoulds in our heads from teachers or professors or from ourselves or from parents, whatever. And I guide people a lot in my daily practice away from the shoulds and what's possible. Instead, what's possible, where can we open to ourselves in the writing? And so while the landscape page is sort of a metaphor both for the outside natural landscape and the horizon where we see sunrises and sunsets, for example, it also opens us to something wider, I believe, inside. And I could get really philosophical, but I'll try not to today.
we might want that, but I do want to just take a quick little pause and invite the people. There's some people that have joined us since we very first started to use the chat box located at the bottom of the screen if you have questions for Jennifer. And Jennifer, if we can't get to them all, are you open to having me send those to you via email, and then I could get if people could send me their emails, and then we could answer them if we run out of time.
Sure, of course. I'm very happy to do that.
I think you have some special people on as guests right now.
Yes, thank you very much for allowing me that. So I really want to welcome the students at Santa Ana College from possibly 2 different classes, English writing classes, and also their instructor, Professor Tran, who I believe are on the call if they've been able to connect. And I do welcome, because one of those classes is using my book in their as part of their text this semester. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free. Oh, I just got a note saying, yes, they're actually here. Thank you, Professor Tran. Yes, we're very happy to answer any questions at any point during this webinar. So please, if you're a student, if you're a grown-up, if you haven't read the book, if you have, doesn't matter, we welcome questions. We want this to be interactive today.
Yes, thank you. Also, I'll bring up another quote until we get some of those questions coming our way. It's easier to be anesthetized with material ease than to actually feel the grief of the places that we visit. I know that's just, I didn't do a very good segue there, but it was another, I thought, really poignant thing that you had to say. I think we do sometimes avoid the things that are hard to see, not only out there, but within us. And so it's just easier to stay busy. And so thank you for bringing that up. Would you like to speak about that just a little bit for us, please?
Yes, I will try and keep that part brief. I've been a hospice volunteer for a very, very long time, and that has included not only working directly with people who are dying and their families, but also doing grief and bereavement work after the fact. And it's very compelling work to me, and so it has ended up featuring in a lot of my writing, and it also I think really speaks to a lot of the clients I work with who at one time or another we've all gone through some kind of grief, and sometimes when we're writing that grief comes up, sometimes a new grief will come up. For my clients who are writing memoir, there's a lot of stuff in there, and it doesn't always feel very good, very pleasant. And again, back to what I was saying about being in a culture where I think it's really easy and natural for us to want to grab onto something out there to feel better or to fix us or to soothe the grief, that sometimes just sitting quietly, and I do it out in the natural world, under a tree, in the shade, along the edge of the Puget Sound, which is near where I live. I'm on a little island. It's just getting quiet and still. And sometimes that means I have to cry a little bit, oh my gosh, or feel some sadness. And then if we allow ourselves to do that a little bit, then we can re-engage what's really up right now, and move into a more full expression of that. I don't really know if that answered your question, but that's, I see the natural world as balm and healer, balm, B-A-L-M, and healer, especially for those tender parts of ourselves, the sad, grieving parts of ourselves that have experienced loss.
Yeah. And I think too, I think sometimes, just take that in a different direction potentially, sometimes we avoid seeing what's really going on in the natural world because it's too hard to look at, and so instead we avoid it because it's too painful. And I think that's, again, maybe potentially an analogy of something that we're doing within ourselves. And so, spending time, in the natural world is healing. And I want to ask you, you have a daily practice of touching the natural world in some way, and that is, can you just tell us about that? I mean, I can, think, what would you say? I could guess what that means for you, but and I know what it would mean for me, but what does it mean for you to do that?
Thank you for asking. So I do write about that, I guess, in the book, in the Hands on the Earth section. Many years ago now, I've always been the person who isn't afraid to touch the natural world. I was playing with snails, if you can imagine, in Southern California, where I was raised from a very, very early age. In fact, snails were a special gift of my mother's tendency to overwater the plants in the yard. And the snails were very drawn to the little puddles that would collect in the bird of paradise plants. And so I would gingerly pluck them off and touch them. I've never been afraid to touch the natural world and have my hands in the dirt. But some years ago, when I was going through a difficult life transition, I started seeking out the actual earth, the grasses, the mud. Where I live up here in the Pacific Northwest is very wet and muddy, and we don't want for slugs and snails up here because we live in such a wet climate. But I started seeking out the going outside and just putting my hands on the grass or the mud or a rock or in some water very briefly. And I sort of wanted to have this challenge. Okay, so what would this be if I did it as a practice? That is, what if I did this every single day, all year long, meaning sometimes putting my hands in water, in January is a really different experience, and sometimes actually painful because the water is so cold compared to maybe putting my hands in a warmed up stream in July. And so I committed to myself that I would literally place my hands palms down on some surface of the earth every single day. And I first set out to do that for a month. And then I decided I would do it for a season and then a year. And now it's been many, many years. And without fail, my hands end up on some surface of the natural world every day. And for me, it's a beautiful, very literally grounding experience of just taking a moment, breathing deeply, smiling or crying, depending on how I feel that day, and just knowing I'm connected. It's like such a blatant and basic act of just saying, "Yep, we're connected. I am Earth." I would not be able to breathe without the air that is generated by all of these living beings. I would not have the beauty to nourish my creative life or to heal my emotional landscape without the natural world. I wouldn't have something to think about and write about if I didn't have a junco nest to explore in my flower basket. And so in all of these ways and more, I think that Hands on the Earth has really become a part of who I am. And I do encourage people to do that.
Yeah, it's really neat. I haven't made it a daily practice at this point, but it's very encouraging to think about doing that. I know that when I feel disconnected from myself, it's time to get back and hug a tree. I actually have my license plate says hugs trees, and
I like that.
And so I'm not as shy to do that. And in fact, I had to settle down a little bit this morning, and a little nervous about having this interview with you, and I made sure I got grounded in nature before we got online, and it was wonderful. And of course, if you look at a lot of the different cultures, we are seeing it all over Facebook now, forest bathing, earthing,
Yes.
All these different things that keep us connected to ourselves because we are nature. And it's only in our minds that we've separated ourselves as something different than that. And so it's just neat that, you've put together a book that helps us see that in a different way, and gave us some hands-on practice to get there. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And I do want want to say, because now this is the second time you've brought up something that I want to just give a shout out, if I might, to a colleague of mine named Trebby Johnson, who's a Vision Quest guide, a wilderness guide, a phenomenal writer, and an incredible human being. And she created an organization, was inspired actually from a Vision Fast to create an organization, nonprofit called Radical Joy for Hard Times. And one of the, I don't want to botch this too much, but she has a whole body of work and practices that she encourages people to do that are really about looking at the grief of natural places that have been hurt around the world, sometimes hurt by human circumstance, sometimes hurt through just the process of climate change or natural processes, things come and go, live and die, and vast areas of land and sea are being hurt in various ways. And so she has a ritual, I'll say, that she offers every single year to people all over the globe, and people all over the globe do actually do this practice, including me. And it's really about just going out and being in a place that's been wounded, a natural place that's been wounded, and telling stories about that. And then the final thing is making something beautiful out in that wounded environment. And so I just really want to, and I will be offering that. Of course, it's free. My offering of that is, and Trebby's work is as well, to do that. It usually happens around the summer solstice in June. I believe this year, I can't see my calendar, but it's maybe the third Saturday in June. And I'll be offering one of those locally for people who might want to join in. But it's a lovely way to just go out. Hey, you get to hike around on a landscape or tell some stories with your friends or family, or do it by yourself, and then to really make something beautiful, often from what we find on the ground lying around in that natural area, including sometimes really beautiful garbage that gets repurposed into some form. So there are a lot of people out there doing this kind of work.
How would we find out about that when you're offering that, you said?
Oh, yes. So on my website, I have many pages on there. One of which is called Events, I believe. It's the tab for that page. And if you click on there and scroll down kind of chronologically, you can see there's a book reading section. And then below that are the events. Some of the events I'll be offering over the next several months.
Okay.
So I'll be find that there. Email me for details. I'd be happy to welcome anybody who wants to do that.
I'll be sure to type your website into the chat box so people can have that. We do have a couple questions that came in, if you wouldn't mind. I'll read them to you. This is from Lynn. We're also going to email you a couple of questions that Lynn had that might be specific to her. But this one, what if we developed massive community New Earth edible landscaping crews with all the natural herbs, edible flowers, veggies, nuts, fruits, berries, and many community solar greenhouses for New Earth Green Civil Services?
Wow, sounds delicious. That would be amazing. What if we did? That would be really incredible, and I would love to write about that kind of work. If you have a project, Lynn, that you're going to be doing that involves that, please let me know, because I would be happy to get involved in some way, to contribute to that work in some way, because I do think you bring up a really good point that I've been hearing over and over again at some of the professional conferences that I've presented my work with. And one of those are global food issues and terracing in big apartments, complexes in countries outside of the US. And so I think that's really important to begin using renewables, to begin being really more conscious about what we're eating and how we're eating it. And when I say how we're eating it, I mean, do we express gratitude for the food we're eating? Because unless it's really so highly processed that it just doesn't resemble something from the earth, even the earth's resources have been used to make the food that we eat. So it is really important. That's one way, speaking of the book, Body, Earth, Mind, and Spirit, one way of reconnecting with a healthier body, and a body that recognizes that this body, this corpus in which I live, is animated by and sustained by the natural world and all of those resources. So thank you so much for your question, Lynn. Appreciate that.
Lynn, I was
Beautiful.
thinking, yeah, I know. And I had this really cool sort of, it ties in with what Lynn's asking. I was on my way to Indiana for a retreat, and I noticed that they were cutting down all of the natural growth, when they had those big medians between the 4-lane highways, just a bunch of grass, and then all along the sides, they're mowing everything down. And our bees and our butterflies are all being, potentially extinct. And I'm like, but that's because we're cutting all this stuff down. Why don't we just let it grow? I mean, it's it saved so much taxpayer money for one. It makes it more beautiful. So maybe going along with what Lynn is saying, planting those things that she's mentioning, but also letting the things grow that's supposed to grow there in the first place.
Yes, I have two quick things I want to say in response to that. One is, when I was the child who was given the task of, in my family, we didn't like yard work very much. It fell to the children often, and usually it wasn't very fun. But when I got the task of using the hoe to try to get the weeds out of the cracks in the grass, because in Southern California and earthquakes, any patch of cement is going to start having cracks. And the weeds, the growing things, are opportunistic. When it was my job to hoe the weeds out of the little cracks in the cement, it's like, but they're beautiful. They're growing. And now on the news last night, I saw lava erupting out of cracks in Hawaii. I mean, just this volcanic activity that's going on right now is so beautiful and terrifying both to watch. And so I'm a rejoicer of all things growing, cracks, asphalt, sides of the roads, whatever. The other thing I want to say is, and then I do want to answer Professor Tran's question, is I wrote in one of my books, not this one, but an earlier book, a story about these craftswomen that I worked with in Rwanda. And they actually, in order to sustain a forever tradition in their culture of weaving baskets in a particular way, they have all of the fields where they're growing their food, and out of that is a weed called new that they that most other farmers cut down so that the food that they're growing has room, and the nourishment from the earth can reach the food that they're growing rather than nourishing the weeds. But these women actually let this weed grow very tall, sometimes 3 or 4 feet high, and then they use that in their basket weaving. So they're actually both allowing it to grow, but also then harvesting it and making another form of beauty, which are these baskets. I can see them here. I don't have one handy to show you, but really incredible, tightly woven baskets. So there are ways to use what we think of as weeds and to also make beauty. So
absolutely. I'm going to read that question because I was just going to jump on that next too.
Okay, great.
It's kind of a two-part question. What has been your hardest work to complete? And secondly, how did you overcome it?
Thank you, Professor Tran, for that. So the first gut response I have to that is to say that the hardest thing to complete, not to start, but to complete, was my dissertation. And oddly, I had all of the material for it. I had done all the research. I had all of the citations and all of those sort of academic things that go along with writing a dissertation. I even had a structure given to me. My goodness, they tell you how many chapters to write and what the titles of the chapters are and exactly what the contents need to be. And I did all of the research. I crunched all of the data. I had my ideas, my theory that I was developing for the outcome. And for about 4 months, I was in a very, very, very stuck place. And I was really scared because I had invested a lot of resources into pursuing this doctorate. And if I didn't finish that dissertation, I would not earn those letters. And then I knew I couldn't live with the distress of having used all of those resources. And so how did I overcome it? Well, first I avoided it. I have to be honest and say for several months, I avoided the issue, and I did every other kind of thing I could think of to not write. And when my deadlines started coming, I ended up having the great fortune of meeting with a committee member who just sat with me and talked over coffee for an hour every week for about 2 months. And I don't remember what we talked about. I always thought I was supposed to be coming and telling him what my struggles were with writing my dissertation, and that he was going to give me the magic answer that would then send me home and finishing the dissertation. And while it didn't happen quite in the way I thought, just having someone supportive and kind to talk through other things that were going on in my life was one way that I overcame it. And then the nitty-gritty truth is that I just had to sit down every single day at my computer and stare at the open page. And I started with what I knew. I started with what was easy. I knew that I'd use certain research methods. We had already explored those things that were already written in a book. So I started with what I knew, and I wrote little bits at a time. And when I got too stuck, I would walk away, but I would set a timer or an alarm so that I came back to the computer. I'd walk away for 15 minutes and have a snack or take a walk around the block, but I always returned to that computer. And that is how I actually ended up writing, overcoming that writing barrier. That said, because I see Kate is reading another question in the sidebar, so I'll just add this little comment, which is that I've had a lot of hard writing projects to complete. And what I've learned in recent years is to trust that it's okay to walk away for a few minutes, not forever, not to put it off or to procrastinate indefinitely, but it's really okay to take a break. It's really okay to write a few words and then put the pen down, or to write a sentence and then walk away. Because for some of us, and I know I'm very much this way, the way I process things and the way I come to understand the world and to know what I think and feel and believe, and then how to turn that into words on the page, is by taking a pause, by, again, going out into a natural landscape where I get great inspiration, or often in the shower, which is a little inconvenient because it's hard to write on with pen and paper in a shower. But that when I'm moving my body and away from the computer is where I can really deepen ideas. And then I go back, then I return to the writing page or the computer.
I like that you admitted that, the inconvenient times when something comes to you.
Yes.
When I was trying to get some stories for this book that I had written, it was like I didn't want to stop the process of what I was doing to like literally write, because it wasn't okay. And I had this idea, and it was before I had a cell phone that had like the little voice recorder on it. I had this little like electronic battery operated little voice recorder, and I did it that way. And now we, are, I don't know if we're fortunate or unfortunate to have this technology at our fingertips at any moment.
Yes.
But it's really handy, like even if you're driving, you could just, say something with, and I know you mentioned that in your book, how you use that tool as well to just, jot down different ideas. But you also had this really cool thing about, you had a basket, I think, on your desk that if you just had some little scratch paper and you just kind of threw it in there, something I want to look at while I'm writing this book. Can you talk about that process?
Yes, there are two things that come to mind when you say that, so I'll reference them both. One is that I take notes on scraps of paper because that's what I have. I like to take paper that might have been a misprint or something out of my computer, and I tear it into the right size for me scrap, which is usually 6 or so to a page. And I just put those in a little basket near where I'm sitting. And so if I have an idea, I can write it down very quickly, usually in scribbly writing that I have a hard time reading later, but scribble it down on a scrap of paper. And then I incorporate that as notes into a book or into some other kind of project that I'm working on, a writing project. But the other side of that is that I have a practice in the book called Scrap the Inner Critic. And it really is a practice about for a moment, just for a few moments, letting go of something that stands between us and the writing page. And I go into a lot of detail, I think, about how that practice works. People can find that in the book. But it's really about this idea that we have these voices in our head and they're not always very friendly. And sometimes it's, we hear our own voice saying, oh gosh, you're a terrible writer, or I just can't do this project, or it's too much, or I don't have time, or fill in the blank. We all have them. And so, again, some of those are things we heard when we were young, from people who were supposed to be teaching us how to do things, and maybe they didn't have their way and our way didn't match very well. And so we were left with a kind of a negative image about ourselves or our writing in particular. And so this Scrap the Inner Critic practice allows us to just for a short time to write something, maybe something we're hearing in our head that isn't a very positive message. You're never going to be able to finish this dissertation, Jennifer, and to write it across a page, usually on a scrap. I don't like to use nice paper for that. Just write it on a scrap, and then I tear it up. Or I fold it and I put it underneath the candle that's sitting on my desk, or a flower vase, or a pretty rock I found. And just for that period of time, for that writing session, half hour, 2 hours, whatever, I can sit there knowing that I've given that voice a little bit of attention, and now I've put it aside. So it's more a symbolic act than, again, some, special medicine that's going to make our writing block go away. It's really about, I've just for now given this voice a little attention, put it aside. And don't worry, I like to tell people at my writing workshops and people I work with, don't worry if that negative voice has been with you long enough that you've had to write it down on a scrap of paper, it'll come back again. So you can use the scrap exercise over and over and over, but it does help us kind of quiet the voices, that the negative messages that we have about ourselves in our writing. But it also then allows us to have more freedom and more room in there so that we can hear our own good, true voice, the one that really wants to be written onto the page.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Just acknowledging it, silences those voices. They're not so loud anymore. And I would think that even in the act of writing it out opens up the writing process,
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really great exercise. I have another quote that I absolutely love. And it's in your book. It was the last one we spoke about before. I'm just going to read it directly. And I'm just going to show the cover of the book again, because when you showed it, it was really, there was a glare. Can you see it okay?
I can see it.
Okay, great.
I'll answer for everybody on the call. We can see it.
Great. So here's the quote. There is an entire and vast wardrobe of coverings that we employ to make it through the moment, the day, the work week, and our lives. Some of these are truly costumes. Even we don't believe that we are the character we dressed up as, but we wear them as a disguise, a way to pretend as if we are funny, wise, older or younger, serious, content or calm. But the writer's writing knows different. It knows the truth. Wow. Right? Anybody who's had to write knows that once you put that on that pen to paper, or if you're typing away, there's some part of that process that makes it be so honest, and that's really what you're wanting to do in the first place anyways. And so we have to drop all of those facades.
Yeah, I'm a professional. I, have this kind of education. I'm this kind way toward all human beings. Whatever it is that we strive to be, we can continue in that striving if we still are remembering our humanity, and that we all have weak moments. We're all frail from time to time, or sad, or have a hard time getting going in our work. And I think there's something really powerful in that acknowledgement. And it's not to say that we're all walking around, pretending to be people we're not. But I think that this is why I so much encourage in this book. And also when I'm doing trainings with people, I did a training with folks from the work for Habitat for Humanity last Friday. And there are a lot of things going on in this particular office. And so the director called me in to use some of these practices with her people. And so I just said, gosh, you're going to write on the page. I'm going to give you these activities. No one's going to see this. Use whatever words, however clumsy or however profane or however sacred they are, put them on the page. No one will see this. And I think the more we can be honest with ourselves, journaling, which some of my clients don't want to hear over and over again, please do your journaling practice, because some people really just don't like to do that. But the more we can honestly write what's going on, unfiltered onto a page, then we are freed to do the kind of writing that we have to do, which might be an academic paper, a paper for school that maybe we don't want to write or feels really hard. But we can do that. We can be emboldened and have courage to do that if we can let some of the other stuff out on the page first.
Awesome. So when you when you came up with the writing practices that you had in your book, Writing on the Landscape, from everything I could tell, you used these for yourself. How did you develop them? How did you figure them out that not just doing them once, but making it a practice, empowered you to become a better writer? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think there are a couple of questions in there, so I'll try and answer both of them briefly, and if I'm not clear, then you can remind me what the questions were. But one thing is I everything that's in this book I have tried myself, and most of them I do as a practice. Obviously, I can't do even these 12 practices, all of them every day, but I know now enough about my own process and my own writing life and my own, not the other part of my life, the rest of my life that isn't about writing, where I need these practices and which ones most serve in a moment. So yes, I've used them all and do use them all. I've also used all of these with clients, with other people, and I use them regularly as kind of what I call the meat and potatoes presentation or training that I do with groups that I'm going into for the first time or maybe for just one visit. And how did I develop them? I mean, I developed them out of sheer desperation and need. I didn't, sit down as kind of a theoretical body of work with my, philosophy hat on and develop them. They just came and they served. And then I tried them very kind of tentatively with early clients and in early workshops and trainings I did. And I saw that they worked for other people. And that's when they started kind of gaining some teeth, some meat, and becoming fleshed out as a body of work. And how do they help? I think they help. Each of them has each of the 12 practices, and I could have probably put 172 practices in here, but I wanted it to be a shorter book. I wanted it to be really accessible to people, where people could just jump into any page and go, okay, I'm going to try this practice today. And I'll just do these parts of this practice and see how that goes for me. Or, gosh, I'm feeling really strong. I'm gonna do, the practices. I have a gentler version and a deeper version, as well as the standard practice for all 12 that are in this book. And that gives people an opportunity to be flexible with where they are in a given day or in their feeling of safety or not in the natural world, to be able to go out and to try these things in a way that works for them. And so I think the how do these work is really individualized. For me, how it might work to go and put my hands on the earth is going to be a really different experience from my neighbor, my next door neighbor who gardens, or it might be really different from some of the students in Southern California who maybe weren't like me as a kid in Santa Ana, putting my hands on every piece of grass I could find in our cement and asphalt world. You know, the cement sidewalks and the asphalt streets where I loved roller skating and riding my bike and playing tennis. But it was putting my hands in the dirt that always got me. And I understand that we're not all going to be doing that. Most of us probably are not going to be doing that, especially if we're in a pretty urban environment. That said, you might see me in an airport somewhere with my hand in the living plants that they have so much now in so many of the airports. And I told that to a client the other day. He got a kick out of it. He was like, I've got to put that in my book. This image of you going around in airports and actually putting your hands in the soil of these planters. It does draw some weird looks sometimes, but it feels really good. I encourage you to take a risk and try it sometime. The how is it's different for everybody, but I do believe it shifts us, even if for a moment we're just taking a break from the day or taking a break to try something new and different. These things too can really open us to a writing life. It can open us to a part of ourselves we forgot, especially if we have an image of, I'm a grown-up and I'm not supposed to put my hands in the dirt. You know, I made mud pies when I was 3 and everyone thought that was cute. Maybe they don't think it's so cute when I'm 53, right? But it feels so good.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to just point out, and you mentioned it just very briefly, I love that you, when you did the exercises in the book, that you did offer a gentler versus a deeper opportunity to write. And, you know, not only maybe someone who's potentially not comfortable with writing, the gentler one, but also just maybe your mood that day. You know, I just need to be more gentle with myself today, or today I feel like I want to challenge myself. And it was just really neat to have both of those opportunities. And I've used them both, you know, depending again, I'm not afraid to challenge myself, but, you know, there's some days when you're just like, wow, maybe it's a time constraint. You're just like, well, I'm just going to do the gentler one because in the effort of time, you know, doing that. I just was, wow, time is just flying through here. I was just noticing that we have about 3 minutes left. And so I would encourage the students that we mentioned earlier to ask, this is your chance. I mean, you got the author right here to ask questions that you might have. Sorry about, looks like we got construction out here. Hopefully you're not hearing that too badly. And then also just wanted to mention again, that, you know, that the Charter for Compassion is putting on this webinar for us. And if you go to charterforcompassion.org, we encourage donations to keep webinars like this coming your way. And we want to, you know, we still have a few minutes, but I want to thank you, Jennifer, again, for your time and your soul and your sharing of who you are and your process. It looks like we've got a question. Yay for us.
Yay. So Hoover wants to know what your least favorite thing about spring is, which is very funny, especially if anybody saw my Monday Musings post on my blog yesterday. My least favorite thing about spring, I think, and this is not the answer maybe you expect, is that it ends. Spring ends, and that's a bummer because I really love the look of the bud of the flower or the leaf when it's just, I know it's going to open but it hasn't yet. I love that, and that moment of time lasts about a day on some of the plants around here. And yes, I'm laughing too. And then the question, Hoover wanted to know, what is your favorite? I think my favorite part of spring is that every day something new seems to be happening. I can look out my window literally every hour and see something a little different that's just happened. Maybe it's as simple as the breeze or the rainbow that we were watching a movie the other night. And I looked out the window I don't know why, for some reason, I was watching a movie. It was a really good movie. And I looked out the window and my mouth fell open. There was a humongous rainbow. I mean, it was wider than God. It's really bright, and it was stretching all the way down through the tree so that even the bottom of it was at eye level, and it arced across the whole sky. I mean, I've seen lots of rainbows in my life, many, many rainbows, but it was just that moment of, wow, if I hadn't looked away from the movie, I would have missed this. And so I love that. I love that there's so much change in the springtime. And thank you for your question and for the joke, Hoover. I appreciate that.
So do I, Hoover. Thank you. And thank you again, Jennifer. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to have to say goodbye to everybody. I will hopefully get those other questions to you via email, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you.
I want to thank the audience for being here. And again, thank you so much for your time and your energy and the space today. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kate. You are so welcome. And thanks so much to the Charter and for everyone who was here.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.